The masterpieces of the Renaissance were bought with African gold. We are taught to see that era as a purely European miracle, a story of local genius and patronage, but the money behind it came from a world away. By the end of this journey, you will see that famous art as the final product of a global economic machine. How did gold from West African rivers end up in the vaults of Florentine bankers? And what does a desert caravan have to do with the Sistine Chapel? We are about to follow the money across continents to find out. What do you believe is the true cost of a cultural revolution? The rivers of West Africa held a secret in their sands, one that would quietly reshape the world. Picture a miner along the upper Senegal River in the 13th century, his hands sifting through silt under a blazing sun. The flecks he finds are not just shiny rocks, they are fragments of a future he cannot see, pieces of a destiny that will one day be melted down to gild the ceilings of distant cathedrals. This was the reality in the legendary goldfields of Wangara, Bambuk, and Bure, regions whose very names became synonymous with almost mythical wealth. For centuries, these lands produced the majority of the gold that reached the Mediterranean and beyond, making West Africa the silent financial engine of continents it had never officially met. The scale was staggering. Arab travelers and historians who ventured south of the Sahara returned with tales that sounded like fables. The 14th century scholar Ibn Battuta described the court of the Mali Empire as a place of overwhelming opulence, where the ruler's authority was literally woven from gold. But this wealth was not simply dug from the ground at random. The gold was alluvial, meaning over millennia, rivers had eroded it from ancient rock formations and deposited it in accessible stream beds. This geological luck made it possible for communities to use relatively simple techniques like panning to harvest incredible fortunes. For the West African empires that controlled these regions, gold was far more than a trade good. It was a sacred metal, a symbol of the ruler's divine connection and the kingdom's vitality. Its extraction was often a ceremonial act, surrounded by rituals and tightly controlled by royal authority to maintain its value and significance. Mining methods evolved from individual panning to more organized pit mining, where teams would dig deep shafts, following rich veins of ore. The empires of Ghana and later Mali did not just possess gold, they mastered its economics, regulating its flow to the north to keep its value astronomically high. The most famous illustration of this wealth is the pilgrimage of Mansa Musa, the emperor of Mali, to Mecca in the 1320s. His caravan was said to include thousands of attendants and hundreds of pounds of gold, which he distributed so generously along his route that he reportedly caused a years-long devaluation of gold in Cairo and other cities. It was an accidental demonstration of economic power on a global stage, a shockwave of pure capital moving from south to north. So when we look at the glittering artifacts of a later age in Europe, we must first see this source, these rivers and these empires. How does it change our story of global history when we acknowledge that the very foundation of medieval and Renaissance wealth was African, patiently waiting in the desert's edge to begin its long, transformative journey? That gold, however, faced a sea of sand before it could reach the world. The Sahara was not a barrier but a bridge, a vast, merciless ocean crossed by the most ambitious sailors on land. Imagine a line of 1,000 camels, a living, groaning thread stitching the continents together across 600 miles of dunes and rock. This was the Caravan, a mobile city of merchants, guards, and guides, undertaking a journey that could last 70 days or more under a sun that showed no mercy. The 14th century geographer al-Bakri wrote of these routes with the precision of a ship's captain, charting oases like ports in a desert sea. He noted the ever-present dangers, from sudden sandstorms that could erase a trail to the threat of thirst that hung over every leg of the voyage. This was not casual trade. It was a monumental feat of logistics and human endurance, a silent partnership between empires who never saw each other's capitals. The true masters of this desert odyssey were the Berber and Tuareg merchants. They were the indispensable middlemen, the only ones with the specialized knowledge to navigate this void. They memorized the stars, reading the night sky like a map. They knew the location of every hidden well, every patch of scrub that could feed their animals. Their success depended on a particular breed of camel, the dromedary, which could carry heavy loads for days without water, its very biology a triumph of adaptation for this specific purpose. The caravan itself was a meticulously organized society on the move. There were scouts riding ahead, blacksmiths to repair equipment, and a strict hierarchy to maintain order. Everyone's survival depended on this cooperation. The cargo moving in each direction tells its own story of value. Traveling south, the most precious commodity was not spice or silk, but salt. Mined from blistering, sun-baked pits at places like Taghaza, great slabs of salt were loaded onto camels. In the forested kingdoms of West Africa, where salt was scarce, it was literally worth its weight in gold, essential for preserving food and sustaining life. Heading north, the camels bore the fruits of that exchange: gold dust carefully sealed in pouches, elephant ivory, a luxury for distant courts, and sadly, other human beings captured in conflict and forced into servitude, a tragic and complex aspect of this economic system. The safe completion of a single caravan was a monumental economic event. When these dusty processions finally reached the northern terminus, like the great trading city of Musa in modern Morocco, it was as if a treasure fleet had docked. Here, in bustling markets, the gold of Africa was weighed, taxed, and transferred to Mediterranean merchants who would carry it to the ports of Europe. So what does the sheer, repeated success of these caravans tell us? It reveals a world already deeply interconnected, a network of cross-cultural cooperation and specialized innovation that flourished centuries before European ships rounded the Cape. The desert did not separate civilizations. It demanded they work together, transforming remote oases into cosmopolitan hubs where the fate of art in Florence could be decided by a bargain struck under a Saharan moon. The desert crossing ended at a city that seemed to rise from a mirage. After weeks of featureless dunes, the sight of Timbuktu's mud brick minarets against the skyline was a profound relief for any traveler. This was not a remote outpost, but a metropolis born from trade, a place where the wealth of the south met the intellectual currents of the north. Timbuktu, along with sister cities like Gao, Janneh, and the northern hub of Ghadames, formed the nervous system of the entire Trans-Saharan network. They were the vital nodes where caravans unloaded, deals were struck, and cultures merged. As historian John Hunwick noted, Timbuktu's greatness lay in its dual identity. It was both a legendary market for gold and a renowned university for scholars. The city's very existence was a testament to the trade's power, its buildings literally funded by the flow of precious metal. To understand their role, picture the infrastructure of these oasis metropolises. At their heart were the bustling souks, markets where the air hummed with a dozen languages. Here, a Berber merchant from the north might barter salt and North African textiles with a jeweler trader from the south, who carried gold dust sealed in feather quills. Nearby, caravanserais provided lodging and security for thousands of camels and their handlers, functioning like ancient desert hotels and warehouses. This commerce was not lawless. It was underpinned by sophisticated administrative systems. Local rulers and city councils ensured security along approach routes and enforced fair taxation, taking a percentage of goods in exchange for peace and stability. This guaranteed trust, making these cities reliable financial hubs where a merchant's word was his bond. The wealth generated did not just buy spices and cloth, it built civilization. The most iconic example is Timbuktu's Sankor Mosque. Constructed in the 14th and 15th centuries, its distinctive pyramidal minaret was more than a place of worship. It was the centerpiece of the Sankor University, an institution that attracted thousands of students to study law, medicine, astronomy, and theology. Its libraries housed tens of thousands of manuscripts, scholarly works on parchment and paper that were bought and copied with trade profits. The university's very existence was a direct investment of commercial capital into intellectual capital. Artisans, poets, and architects flocked to these cities, drawn by patronage and opportunity, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that rivaled any contemporary center in the world. This reality forces us to ask a pivotal question. How do these vibrant, connected African centers reshape our understanding of the past? They completely dismantle the outdated stereotype of a pre-colonial Africa isolated from global currents. Timbuktu, Gao, and Djenné were not endpoints, they were dynamic processors. They took in raw gold and sent out refined ideas, legal principles, and artistic styles along the same routes. The intellectual energy cultivated in these sun-baked libraries and courtyards was a crucial precursor to the next phase of the journey. For the gold that financed scholarship here was also on a longer trip, one that would see it cross another sea, not of sand, but of water, heading toward a continent on the brink of an artistic explosion it could not yet imagine. This intricate trade network relied on a remarkable system of silent trust. In the gold-producing regions, transactions often occurred without the parties ever meeting face to face. This was the practice of silent barter, a protocol so well established it functioned like an unspoken law. A caravan of northern merchants would arrive at a designated trading zone, perhaps a clearing near a river. They would lay out their goods, salt slabs, copper ingots, bolts of fine cloth, and then retreat a significant distance. Local gold traders would then approach, inspect the offerings, and place beside them what they considered a fair amount of gold dust. They too would withdraw. The northern merchants would return, and if they were satisfied with the payment, they would take the gold and leave, completing the exchange without a single spoken word. This ritual was not born of secrecy, but of security and mutual respect, a way to bridge language barriers and maintain peace in a high-stakes environment. It was commerce conducted on a foundation of pure, enforced trust, proving that the entire system was built on predictable, long-term relationships. At its core, this was a trade of complementary necessities, each side offering what the other lacked and deeply desired. The most famous pairing was, of course, gold for salt. To us today, salt is a cheap seasoning, but in the forested kingdoms of West Africa, it was a biological imperative. In a hot climate without refrigeration, salt was the only reliable means to preserve meat and fish, preventing spoilage and securing food supplies through lean seasons. It was also crucial for human health, replacing electrolytes lost through sweat. This made it a literal lifesaver. Consequently, its value was astronomical. The 11th century geographer al-Bakri recorded the stunning exchange rates, noting that in some markets, salt and gold could trade pound for pound. A slab of Saharan salt could be worth its literal weight in gold dust. Beyond its utility, salt became a potent status symbol. Displaying and gifting salt demonstrated wealth and access to distant trade networks, much like luxury goods do today. But the caravans carried far more than these two iconic commodities. They were the arteries of an entire material culture. Traveling south were goods that represented the manufactured sophistication of the Mediterranean and Arab worlds. Copper from mines in North Africa and Europe was highly prized for making tools and ornamental objects. Vibrant textiles, intricate glassware, and especially books and manuscripts made the journey, bringing not just goods but ideas, technology, and artistic styles to the southern empires. In return, heading north alongside the gold were other treasures of the African interior: elephant ivory, sought after for intricate carvings and luxury items across Eurasia; kola nuts, a mild stimulant that was chewed socially; and in a tragic dimension of the trade, some human beings were also transported, individuals caught in conflicts and forced into servitude, a painful reminder of the era's complex social structures. The salt itself had a harrowing origin story. It came from places like the mines of Taghaza, located in the heart of the northern Sahara. This was a place of utter desolation, described by travelers as a cursed land. Enslaved laborers and local workers mined the salt in brutal conditions, under a relentless sun, hacking solid slabs from the earth. These slabs were then shaped into uniform blocks, perfectly sized for loading onto the sides of camels. Each block was a unit of currency, born from hardship and destined to be traded for a fortune. So we must ask, in our own globalized economy, what commodities hold a similar fundamental power over life and society? What modern resource is so essential that its flow can dictate the fate of nations and quietly finance new eras of human achievement? This was the genius of the Trans-Saharan system. It was not extraction but a balanced exchange. The South received the salt it needed to thrive, and the North received the gold that would fuel its ambitions. This reciprocity created sustainable wealth and interdependence, making the desert not a barrier but a bridge of mutual need. The gold's journey was not complete when it left the desert. In the bustling northern markets of Fez or Tunis, that raw, dusty treasure underwent a profound transformation. Here, under the watchful eyes of royal assayers, gold dust was poured onto delicate scales, its purity tested by fire and touch. This was the moment it ceased to be a mere commodity and became a true currency, a unit of power recognized across continents. The North African dynasties that controlled these gateways were the architects of this final, crucial stage. First the Almoravids, then the Almohads, and later the Marinid sultans. These empires did not just tax the caravans, they systematized the entire flow of wealth. As the esteemed economic historian Janet L. Abu Lughod described it, they acted as the indispensable middle managers of a globalizing economy, creating the stable, regulated environment that allowed such vast wealth to move securely. Their power was built directly upon their control of the trade's northern terminals. Take the city of Musa, a legendary starting point for southbound caravans and the first stop for northbound gold. In its fortified mints, raw gold was melted, alloyed for durability, and struck into coins. The most famous of these was the Almoravid dinar, a coin of such reliable purity and weight that its reputation spread from England to Egypt. Holding one of these dinars was like holding a piece of Africa, standardized and ready for the world. But moving chests of heavy coinage across the Mediterranean was risky and inefficient. This practical challenge sparked remarkable financial innovation. Merchants began using written instruments of credit known as saftaja. Imagine a merchant in Tunis who has just sold a shipment of cloth. Instead of receiving a heavy load of dinars, he gets a letter of credit from a trusted banking house. He could travel to Alexandria or Palermo and present that letter to a corresponding agent, who would then pay him the equivalent sum from their own reserves. This was an early form of banking, a system of trust that reduced physical risk and accelerated the velocity of commerce. It meant capital could move almost invisibly, ahead of the ships that carried the actual metal. The ultimate destinations for this monetized gold were the Mediterranean ports. Cities like Ceuta, Algiers, and Tunis became glittering interfaces between the Saharan and European worlds. Their harbors were crowded with ships from Genoa, Venice, and Barcelona, captains and merchants all vying for a share of the golden stream. The strategic value of these ports cannot be overstated. Their possession meant control over the tap of wealth flowing from the south. This is precisely why the Portuguese and Spanish launched relentless campaigns to capture strongholds like Ceuta. They were not just seeking territory, they were attempting to seize the very source of the financial lifeblood that was enriching their rivals. So we must ask, what does this sophisticated system of mints, credit, and ports reveal? It shows a North Africa that was not a passive in point, but a dynamic financial processor. The need to manage this colossal influx of gold forced the creation of advanced economic tools that would later be adopted and adapted in Europe. The gold that entered these ports was no longer African dust. It was liquid international capital, and it was now poised for the final, fateful crossing, heading straight for the vaults of the rising merchant princes who would use it to buy a new vision of the world. The final port of call was a city built on water. In a dimly lit Venetian counting house during the 1400s, a merchant banker unsealed a leather pouch, its contents catching the flickering light of an oil lamp. This was not minted coin, but raw gold dust shipped across the sea from Alexandria, its origin traceable to the sands of a West African river. His quill scratched across a ledger as he calculated the potential locked within those tiny, gleaming particles. This was the moment of final transfer, where African wealth entered the European financial system, and the hands that now held it belonged to the rising merchant princes of the Italian peninsula. Venice, Genoa, and Florence were not just cities, they were corporate empires perfectly engineered to capture this flow of capital. Their power rested on two pillars: naval dominance and financial innovation. Their great fleets controlled the sea lanes of the Mediterranean, turning the sea into an Italian highway. More importantly, they established a network of fortified trading colonies, called fondacos, in key ports from Constantinople to Alexandria, and crucially, along the North African coast. These were not simple warehouses, but semi-autonomous commercial embassies where Italian agents lived permanently, negotiating deals, gathering market intelligence, and smoothing the transfer of goods. The personal diaries of these merchants, preserved in archives, reveal the tense reality behind the profits. They speak of the constant anxiety of shipwrecks and pirates, and of the delicate diplomacy required to maintain favor with local sultans. One Venetian trader's journal from the 1430s laments a lost shipment, writing of the heartbreaking news from Tunis, while another entry, weeks later, celebrates a successful venture with pure, unadulterated joy at the quality of the gold received. To acquire this gold, the Europeans had to offer something of equal value. Their chief exports tell a story of their own industrial specialization. Fine woolen cloth from Flanders and Florence was in high demand across North Africa. Intricate glassware from Murano, a testament to Venetian craftsmanship, was a prized luxury. They even traded in armor and weaponry, a sobering exchange of military technology. But perhaps the most strategic commodity they offered was silver, mined from the veins of Central Europe in places like Saxony. In the bimetallic economies of the Mediterranean, silver was the complementary currency to gold, and its flow south helped balance the massive northward flow of African gold, completing a complex circuit of precious metals. So we must pause and ask a pivotal question. Why were these fragmented Italian city-states, and not powerful kingdoms like France or England, the ones to become the bankers of Europe? Geography provided the first clue. Jutting into the Mediterranean, Italy was the natural maritime bridge between the continents, but the real answer lies in their social and political structures. These were republics dominated by merchant oligarchies, where profit and capital accumulation were the central goals of the state itself. A king might wage war for glory or territory, but a Venetian doge or a Florentine signoria understood that their power was measured in ducats and florins. They were agile commercial enterprises in the guise of governments, and they positioned themselves with ruthless precision to control the single most important financial resource of their age. The gold that financed their ambitions was now in their vaults, ready to fund a project far grander than any trading voyage. But this gold had a job to do beyond filling private vaults. Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries was suffering from a severe economic stagnation, a kind of financial constipation. The problem was a desperate shortage of gold coinage. For centuries, European kingdoms had relied on silver pennies for most daily transactions, but their supplies of gold were meager and often hoarded. This created a bullion famine, a critical lack of the high-value money needed to finance large-scale trade between nations, pay armies, or fund royal governments. Commerce was slowing, limited by the very medium meant to enable it. The arrival of West African gold through Italian ports was not just a windfall, it was an economic defibrillator. Financial historian Peter Spufford likened this new gold to the oil that greased the wheels of a seized-up machine. It provided the essential bullion to remonetize entire economies, injecting a powerful new form of liquidity into a system that was gasping for it. The transformation happened at the Mint. In the year 1252, the city of Florence took a revolutionary step. Using gold that had traveled from the Sahara, they struck a new coin of exceptional purity and consistent weight, the florin. Venice soon followed with its own gold ducat. These were not just coins, they were financial instruments of trust. Each florin contained about 3.5 grams of nearly pure gold, and its value was guaranteed by the reputation of the Florentine Republic itself. This reliability was everything. Before these coins, a merchant in Bruges receiving payment from a partner in Genoa might get a bag of mixed silver coins, each from a different kingdom, each with a different and often degraded silver content. The value was uncertain, requiring complex weighing and assaying at every transaction. The florin and ducat changed the game. They became the dollar and the euro of their day, a universal currency accepted from London to Constantinople because everyone trusted the gold inside. We can see this new power in action through the surviving ledgers of the great banking families. Take the Peruzzi Company of Florence. Their account books from the early 1300s show transactions spanning continents, with loans to kings and payments for English wool all calculated in the steady, unchanging unit of the florin. A single entry might record a loan of tens of thousands of florins to the King of Naples, a sum that would have been impossible to raise and transfer in the old patchwork of silver. This was the new gold at work, moving as easily as ink on a page, enabling financial operations on a previously unimaginable scale. It provided the monetary stability that all ambitious projects, whether a royal war or a merchant's trading fleet, desperately required. So we must ask ourselves a fundamental question that echoes from that era to our own. Can any complex economy, any civilization with grand aspirations, truly function without a reliable and abundant medium of exchange? For late medieval Europe, the answer was a resounding no. And the solution arrived not from local mines, but from across a desert, quietly solving a crisis that had threatened to choke its future. The vibrant blue of the Virgin Mary's robe in a Florentine chapel is not just a color, it is a bank statement. This particular shade, ultramarine, was the most expensive pigment in the world, painstakingly ground from lapis lazuli stones mined in a single remote region of Afghanistan. To purchase it, a patron needed pure, liquid wealth, and in 15th century Italy that meant Florentine florins. Here is the first and most direct way to trace the hidden connection: follow the specific coin. The florin, struck from African gold, is the literal thread stitching the desert to the dome. We can see this in surviving contracts, like the one between the wealthy merchant Giovanni Tornabuoni and the painter Domenico Ghirlandaio in 1485. It meticulously specifies that Ghirlandaio will be paid 120 large florins to fresco the choir of Santa Maria Novella. a sum that covered not only the artist's skill but also the lavish materials, including that precious ultramarine. Payment was not in vague promises or bartered goods, but in the standardized, internationally recognized currency born from Trans-Saharan trade. This system of direct patronage was the engine of the Renaissance, and it was dominated by a new class of ultra-wealthy families, the Medici, the Strozzi, the Rusuli. Their fortunes were not built on ancient land holdings, but on modern finance, banking, and international commerce, sectors deeply intertwined with the flow of gold and goods through Mediterranean ports. Investing in art was a strategic move with multiple returns. On one level, it was an act of piety, commissioning religious works to ensure salvation, a powerful concern of the era. On another, it was a brilliant form of social branding and political soft power. A magnificent family chapel or a towering public sculpture did not just beautify the city, it permanently inscribed the patron's name, wealth, and taste into the very fabric of civic life. The art was their legacy and their advertisement. So many iconic works were direct products of this financed patronage. Filippo Brunelleschi's revolutionary dome for the Florence Cathedral, an engineering marvel, required vast capital for materials and labor, funded by the Wool Guild and wealthy citizens whose wealth was tied to trade. Donatello's expressive bronze sculptures, like his David, were commissioned by the Medici for their palace courtyard, a display of both artistic and financial mastery. Sandro Botticelli's ethereal paintings, including The Birth of Venus, were created for the Medici villas, their mythological themes reflecting the humanist learning that merchant wealth also supported. Consider Cosimo de' Medici, the patriarch of the dynasty. His bank's branches stretched from London to Constantinople, its profits fueled by managing papal finances and facilitating international trade, a system that relied on the stable gold standard the Florin provided. With a portion of those profits, Cosimo funded the complete reconstruction of the Basilica of San Lorenzo, his family's parish church, turning it into a Renaissance masterpiece. The connection is not abstract, it is architectural and financial, so we must look at these works with a dual vision. When you stand before the serene beauty of a Botticelli or gaze up at Brunelleschi's dome, are you seeing only a triumph of artistic genius, or can you also perceive the ghostly imprint of a gold coin, a tiny piece of Africa that traveled across a desert and a sea to make that moment of beauty a tangible, paid-for reality? The Florin was the quiet messenger delivering the means to turn ambition into art. That gold dust recorded in the ledger had a specific name, oro di paglia, gold of straw. To decode the Renaissance economy, you must learn to read the language of its merchants, preserved in the ink-stained pages of their account books. In a quiet archive in Prato, Italy, lies a treasure more revealing than any coin hoard, the personal papers of a 14th-century merchant named Francesco Dattini. Over 70,000 letters, 500 ledgers, and countless contracts, all meticulously saved by a man who scribbled for God and for profit on his documents. This archive is a time machine, offering us a direct line into the daily reality of financing a cultural revolution. Scholars like Iris Origo, who studied these papers, describe a world of calculated risk and meticulous record-keeping, where every transaction, from a shipment of Iberian wool to a purchase of African gold dust, was logged with sober precision. To read these ledgers is to see the anatomy of profit. The key terms are our clues. Oro di paglia itself refers to the raw, unminted gold dust imported from the Barbary coast, the European term for North Africa. Entries noting goods sent to Tunisia or Baugi or sold to Mercante Moreso, a Moorish merchant, trace the physical and human connections across the Mediterranean. The profit margins recorded are stark. A shipment of Lombard cloth might be sold in Tunis for a 60% markup, with the return profit taken not in more goods, but in that raw oro di paglia, the most liquid asset of all. This repatriated gold was the ultimate goal, the final link in a chain that turned European cloth into African gold, and then into Florentine currency. But these books also record the immense risks that justified such high returns. Neat columns of numbers are punctuated by grim notes, brief mentions of a ship lost to a storm off Sardinia, or a cargo seized by pirates from Rhodes. A default on a loan by a distant trading partner could wipe out a year's profits. This ever-present danger is why the successful voyages had to yield such spectacular rewards, and why the entire system depended on networks of trust and complex insurance contracts, which themselves were an innovation driven by this risky, long-distance trade. Francesco Datini's own story embodies this cycle. He made a fortune as a merchant and banker, dealing extensively in the Mediterranean trade. His ledgers show investments in everything from armor to spices, and yes, transactions involving gold from Africa. And then, crucially, his wealth flowed into the artistic life of his city. He commissioned frescoes for his home and donated to local churches, directly converting commercial profit into cultural capital. His papers even include correspondence about the hiring of artists, detailing payments for pigments and labor. So we are left to ponder, in our own digital age of encrypted transactions and cloud storage, what will be the equivalent of Datini's ledger? What immutable record will we leave behind that so transparently connects a source of wealth, the mechanics of its acquisition, and the beautiful, enduring things it was used to build? These parchment pages are the silent witnesses, the undeniable paper trail proving that the Renaissance was not just inspired, it was invoiced. The vaults of the Medici Bank held more than gold, they held a new way of thinking about money itself. Step inside their headquarters on the Via Larga in Florence, and the air would have been thick with the scent of ink and parchment, not the metallic tang of coins. Clerks hunched over massive ledgers, not counting piles of florins, but recording intricate transactions on paper, moving fortunes across Europe with the stroke of a pen. This was the revolutionary mechanism, a financial engine whose smooth operation depended entirely on a hidden fuel, the steady, reliable influx of precious metal from afar. The Medici were not merely wealthy art lovers, they were architects of modern finance, and their entire system was built upon a foundation of gold that originated in West Africa. As the esteemed economic historian Raymond de Rouva detailed, the family's genius lay in their network of branch banks. They established semi-independent offices in Bruges, London, Geneva, and Rome, each managed by a partner who shared in the profits. This structure allowed them to perform a kind of monetary magic, moving value across borders without the perilous physical transport of bullion. A merchant in Florence needing to pay a supplier in London would simply purchase a bill of exchange from the Medici. This document, a precursor to the modern check, was a promise from the London branch to pay the specified sum upon presentation. The Florentine merchant would send this lightweight paper by courier, a far safer method than shipping chests of coins. The London branch would then pay the supplier from its own reserves, funds accumulated from local business. At the end of a trading season, the branches would settle their accounts through a clearing system, often just by adjusting the numbers in their shared ledgers. For this elegant system to inspire trust, however, every branch needed to maintain a tangible reserve of gold and silver. The credibility of the paper promise rested on the certainty of metal in the vault. This is where the Trans-Saharan gold stream was indispensable, providing the hard currency backbone that made the Medici's paper-based credit system possible. Their innovations were multifaceted. They perfected the bill of exchange. They were early adopters of double-entry bookkeeping, which brought unprecedented clarity to their complex international dealings, allowing them to see their true financial position at a glance. And crucially, they actively took deposits from wealthy clients, money they could then lend out at interest to other merchants or even to princes. This practice of fractional reserve banking, creating credit from deposits, multiplied the economic power of their actual gold reserves. But where did the Medici wealth originate to build this empire? Their power was not abstract, it was rooted in very concrete trade. They were major players in the alum trade, controlling mines that produced this essential mineral used to fix dyes in the vibrant textiles of Florence. They also financed the wool and silk industries. These luxury goods were then exported south across the Mediterranean, often to the very North African ports that were the terminus points for the Saharan caravans. The profits from selling these textiles were frequently repatriated not in more goods, but in gold, completing a commercial loop that fed directly into their banking reserves. The most potent example of their financial reach was their Roman branch. For decades, the Medici acted as the primary bankers to the papacy, managing the vast revenues flowing into the Holy See from across Christendom. They collected tithes, transferred funds for crusades, and financed the papal court itself. The capital they used for these enormous operations was not divine, it was commercial, generated by their textile and trading ventures tied to the Mediterranean gold flow. This forces us to confront a pivotal question: how does access to abundant, stable capital fundamentally alter what is possible? When a bank is not perpetually scrambling for bullion, it can think in longer terms, fund riskier ventures, and build systems of credit that accelerate economic growth. The Medici model, lubricated by African gold, did not just fund art, it built the prototype for the entire global financial system that followed. Their ledgers were the blueprints for a new world of capital. A letter of credit is a promise written on paper, a fragile thing. Yet in 15th century Italy, such a document could purchase a mountain of marble in Carrara or secure a shipload of spices from Alexandria, all without a single physical coin changing hands at the moment of the deal. This was the true, transformative power of the gold flowing in from across the Sahara. Its most vital role was not to be spent, but to sit quietly in vaults, acting as the unshakable foundation for an entire world of credit. The economic philosopher Adam Smith, writing centuries later, would pinpoint this principle, noting that a reserve of precious metal was the essential ballast for any nation wishing to engage in extensive commerce. The gold was the anchor, but the credit it secured was the sail, catching the wind of ambition to propel ventures that raw coinage alone could never finance. This system marked a profound conceptual leap, the distinction between commodity money and credit money. Commodity money is the thing itself, a gold florin you can hold, its value inherent in the metal. Credit money is something far more abstract, a promise to pay that gold in the future. A bill of exchange from the Medici Bank was a piece of credit money. Its worth was not in the parchment, but in the absolute trust that the Medici had the florins in their vault to back it up. That trust was purchased with the visible, tangible reality of their gold reserves, much of which originated as African oro di paglia. This allowed capital to become fluid and mobile. A merchant could now undertake a risky, 2-year trading voyage to the Levant without first amassing a fortune in heavy, vulnerable coin. He could use letters of credit to pay for supplies along the way, settling all accounts only when his profitable return voyage was complete. The gold in the vault back home did the work of guaranteeing all these simultaneous, far-flung transactions. We can see this credit engine funding history's most famous gamble, the voyage of Christopher Columbus. The expedition was not paid for with a chest of gold coins handed to the explorer. It was a complex web of credit and future promises. Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon authorized the venture, but much of the actual funding came from loans advanced by Italian and Spanish merchant bankers. These bankers were willing to extend this credit based on the Crown's expected future revenues and, critically, on the anticipation of new sources of precious metals. The voyage itself was a speculative letter of credit drawn on the future of a continent. and the security for that credit was the very idea of gold, the same driving force that had been enriching Europe for centuries. This model also operated on a smaller, artistic scale. When a patron commissioned a fresco that would take a year to complete, the artist and his workshop needed to buy materials and live while they worked. Payments were often made in installments, documented by notarized contracts that functioned as credit agreements, backed ultimately by the patron's wealth stored in gold and other assets. The entire Renaissance economy was, in essence, a sophisticated dance of deferred payment, all moving to the steady rhythm of reliable bullion. This leads us to a reflective question about our own time. Our modern financial system has completely severed the link between paper currency and physical gold. A dollar bill or a digital bank entry is a pure promise, backed not by a metal, but by the full faith and credit of a government and the complex web of the global economy. Is this system more or less stable than the Renaissance model anchored by desert gold? One could argue it is more flexible, capable of expanding to meet the needs of a planet-spanning civilization. Yet the Renaissance system possessed a brutal, tangible clarity. The trust in a letter of credit was not blind faith in an institution. It was a calculated belief in a specific, gleaming reality in a vault downstairs. That concrete trust is what unlocked the economic potential, turning stored African wealth into the active capital that could buy a voyage into the unknown or a vision onto a chapel wall. The gold was the silent partner in every transaction, the hidden weight that gave flight to paper promises. The sound of 1,000 chisels striking marble echoed through Florence, a percussive hymn to ambition. This was the Florence Cathedral worksite in the early 1400s, a public spectacle of creation funded by the deep pockets of the city's powerful guilds and merchant families. Here, the abstract flow of gold from distant trade was physically transmuted into the iconic stone and dome of the Renaissance, an architectural alchemy that turned profit into permanence. Antonio Manetti, the biographer of the dome's genius engineer Filippo Brunelleschi, wrote of the enormous cost and the immense civic pride involved, noting that the project was a testament to the entire city's wealth and will. This was not a king's solitary decree, but a collective investment, a transformation of liquid capital into civic identity. The funding mechanisms reveal everything. Major projects were financed through a combination of direct taxation and voluntary contributions from the city's elite, families like the Medici, Strozzi, and Pazzi. Their fortunes, built on banking and the import-export trade linking Italy to North Africa and beyond, were literally poured into the city's foundations. Consider the Ospedale degli Innocenti, a pioneering children's hospital with its graceful arched loggia designed by Brunelleschi. It was funded entirely by the Silk Guild, a direct link between the luxury textile trade, which depended on imported dyes and exported finished cloth, and an enduring act of public charity. The Palazzo Vecchio, the fortress-like town hall, was expanded and adorned with art paid for by the city government, its coffers filled with taxes on commercial transactions. In Venice, the majestic palaces lining the Grand Canal, with their distinctive facades of Istrian stone, were the direct real estate investments of merchant dynasties whose wealth flowed from the Adriatic and Mediterranean trades. Perhaps the most ingenious example is the funding of the Santa Maria del Fiore Cathedral's dome itself. Facing a staggering budget shortfall, the Opera del Duomo, the Works Committee, authorized a public lottery and even a special tax on wine sold in the city. These methods only worked because Florence possessed a flourishing, cash-rich commercial economy. People had disposable income to buy lottery tickets, and taverns were busy because commerce was thriving. This architectural legacy forces a profound question. What do a society's grandest, most enduring building projects truly reveal about its hidden economic priorities and power structures? The Duomo's dome is not just an engineering marvel, it is a fiscal one. Its curves trace the invisible arc of capital from a gold dust trader in Timbuktu to a spice merchant in Venice to a tax collector in Florence, and finally into the hands of a stonecutter on a scaffold. The stone and mortar of the Renaissance are not silent. They are monuments to liquid capital made solid, a permanent record of wealth that traveled farther than anyone at the groundbreaking ceremony could have possibly known. But for every detailed entry in an Italian ledger, there is a missing counterpart, a ghost page in the story. In the ancient libraries of Timbuktu, manuscripts written on fragile paper and cured leather have survived for centuries, hidden in desert sand or sealed in metal trunks to protect them from the harsh climate. They contain treatises on astronomy, poetry, and Islamic law, a testament to a profound scholarly tradition. Yet among these surviving texts, the detailed financial records, the day-to-day ledgers from the West African side of this monumental trade, remain elusive. This absence is the third great mystery, the lost ledgers of Timbuktu, and it has left our historical narrative profoundly lopsided. We can follow the gold with precision once it reaches Europe, but its journey from the riverbank to the caravan remains shrouded in silence. Why does one side of the conversation have such a clear voice, while the other speaks mostly in whispers? The work of Malian historians and preservationists offers a clue. Individuals like Dr. Abdulkader Haidara, who led a heroic effort to smuggle and safeguard hundreds of thousands of manuscripts from threat in the early 2000s, remind us that the written record is vast but still largely unread by the wider world. He has spoken of finding documents that mention commercial agreements and trade goods, fragments of the economic story waiting to be pieced together. The scarcity of these business records is not an accident of history, but the result of several intersecting forces. First, the power of oral tradition. In many West African societies, complex agreements, genealogies, and historical accounts were entrusted to specialized griots, master storytellers, and historians who committed them to memory. A commercial contract might be sealed with a spoken oath and witnessed by community elders, a system built on social trust rather than paper. Second, the climate itself is an enemy of parchment and paper. The Saharan heat and humidity are relentless, causing organic materials to decay far more quickly than in the dry, cool archives of an Italian palazzo. Many records simply did not survive the passage of time. Third, and most profoundly, came periods of immense disruption. The Moroccan invasion of the Songhai Empire in the late 16th century, followed by later regional conflicts and the colonial period, led to instability, the dispersal of collections, and the irrevocable loss of countless documents. What kinds of records are we missing? We can infer their existence from the sophistication of the empires themselves. There would have been detailed tax rolls from the great trading cities, recording the duties paid on each camel load of salt or gold. There would have been commercial contracts between jeweler merchants and their Berber partners, outlining shares of profit and responsibility for losses. Most fascinating would be the personal correspondence between Sudanese and Maghrebi merchants, letters that would reveal the human relationships, the disputes, and the friendships that underpinned this centuries-long exchange. We catch fleeting glimpses in the chronicles that did survive. The Tariq al-Sudan, a 17th-century history of the Songhai Empire, provides invaluable political narrative and mentions market prices and trade goods, but it is not an accountant's ledger. It tells us the trade happened, but not with the granular detail of a Medici bank book. This imbalance forces us to ask a difficult, reflective question. How does the loss of one side of a historical ledger permanently skew our understanding of a global exchange? It risks reducing Africa's role to that of a passive source, a mineral-rich landscape, rather than the home of active, sophisticated economies and financial minds who managed this wealth for generations. The potential locked in undiscovered or unstudied manuscripts is staggering. A single folio detailing a royal monopoly on gold dust, or a merchant's diary from a caravan stop could rewrite chapters of economic history, restoring agency and complexity to the southern half of the story. The search for these lost ledgers is not just academic, it is an act of rebalancing the scales of memory itself. The same gold that built cathedrals also purchased the maps that would shrink the world. In a Lisbon workshop in the 1450s, a cartographer dipped his pen, adding a new, tentative bulge to the coastline of West Africa, a detail whispered by a captain returning from a voyage financed by Prince Henry the Navigator. This was not idle curiosity, it was a strategic investment. The chronicler Gomes Eanes de Zorara, writing of Henry's motivations, was strikingly candid. He listed them plainly: a desire to know the lands beyond the Canary Islands, to find allies against rival powers, and crucially, to discover the source of the gold that was reaching Morocco by caravan. The pursuit of knowledge and the pursuit of profit were two sides of the same golden coin. The wealth generated by the Trans-Saharan trade did not merely decorate palaces, it actively funded the intellectual and exploratory infrastructure of a new age. This ripple effect transformed how Europe saw the world, literally and figuratively. One of the most profound channels was the revival of classical learning. As trade with North Africa flourished, so did contact with the Arab world, which had preserved and expanded upon ancient Greek and Roman texts lost to Europe for centuries. The translation movement, often funded by merchant patrons, saw works by Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Galen translated from Arabic into Latin, sparking a revolution in philosophy, medicine, and astronomy. The Medici family, for instance, used their banking wealth to fund the Platonic Academy in Florence, a gathering of scholars dedicated to studying the original works of Plato, many of which had reached Italy through these very Mediterranean networks. Knowledge of geography and navigation saw the most direct investment. The Portuguese crown, desperate to access West African gold sources directly and bypass the costly Saharan middlemen, poured caravan profits into what we would now call research and development. They established a center for navigational science at Sagres, funding mathematicians, astronomers, and cartographers. The critical innovation they bankrolled was the Caravan, a nimble, lateen-rigged ship capable of sailing windward, a technological leap that made exploring the treacherous West African coast possible. This was venture capital on a national scale, with gold as the expected return. We can see the fusion of this commercially sourced knowledge in objects like the magnificent Catalan Atlas of 1375. Created by the Jewish cartographer Abraham Frescoes in Majorca, this map was a masterpiece of medieval geography. It vividly depicted the Sahara with a caravan led by a Berber merchant, and south of the desert, it showed a powerful African king, Mansa Musa, holding a large gold nugget. The atlas did not invent this information, it synthesized it, drawing directly on the first-hand accounts of Muslim and Jewish traders who were active participants in the Trans-Saharan network. The map was both a product of that trade and a tool for its future expansion, so we are left to ponder a timeless dynamic. Is the pure pursuit of knowledge ever truly separate from the pursuit of economic or strategic advantage? The Renaissance humanist studying a recovered Greek text and the Portuguese navigator charting a course to a gold-rich river were both beneficiaries of the same financial stream. One sought to understand the cosmos, the other to control commerce, but their work was funded by the same distant minds. The quest for gold, in its relentless drive, did not just finance art, it financed the very tools of discovery that would ultimately reveal a world far larger and more complex than the trade routes that had set the search in motion. A portrait is a ledger written in silk and gold. Look closely at the sumptuous gown worn by Giovanna degli Albizzi Tornabuoni in Domenico Ghirlandaio's portrait from the 1480s. The fabric is not a simple cloth, It is a brocade woven with intricate patterns, and the delicate trim along her sleeves is not just decorative, it is real gold thread meticulously embroidered. This is not merely a pretty picture, it is a calculated display, a public declaration of wealth so specific it can be traced back to the marketplace. Art historian Evelyn Welch reminds us that in an age before photography, a portrait was a permanent statement of identity, and every object within it was chosen with immense care to communicate status, piety, and connections. We can use these paintings as historical documents, decoding the luxury goods to map the invisible trade routes that brought them there. The first clue is often in the fabrics. The deep, vibrant red of a velvet gown or the complex pattern of a brocade points to the Italian textile industry, which itself depended on imported dyes like alum and madder, substances traded through the same Mediterranean networks that carried gold. The pearls draped around Giovanna's neck and woven into her hair are another powerful signifier. In the Renaissance, the finest pearls came from the Indian Ocean, harvested off the coast of Bahrain and Sri Lanka. They reached Europe via a long chain of merchants, passing through Alexandria or the Levant before being shipped to Venice. Their presence in a Florentine portrait is a direct link to those distant waters, proof that the sitter's family had the liquid capital to purchase one of the most expensive luxuries in the world. Then there is the setting itself. Look at the backgrounds of many Renaissance portraits, and you will often see an ornate carpet draped over a balcony or a table. These were not floor coverings in the European style, but prized display items often called Oriental carpets. Art historical analysis places many of these carpets as originating from Anatolia or Egypt under the Mamluk Sultanate. They entered Europe primarily through Venetian traders, who acquired them in ports that also did business with North African merchants. A single carpet in a painting is therefore a snapshot of the entire Eastern Mediterranean trade web. Even the small, beautifully illuminated prayer book in Giovanna's hands is a clue. Such books were luxury items, bound in fine leather and filled with pages of hand-painted illustrations on vellum, requiring skilled labor and expensive materials. Their ownership spoke of both piety and disposable income. The portrait of Giovanna is a perfect case study. She was a member of the Albizzi family, married into the Tornabuoni, both powerful merchant clans deeply embedded in Florentine banking and trade. Her portrait, commissioned by her husband after her passing, is a memorial, but it is also an economic resume. Every element, from the pearls to the brocade to the Latin inscription highlighting her virtues, was funded by the profits of commerce, profits that were inseparable from the flow of gold and credit. This invites a reflective question about our own time. What do the objects we choose to display in our own portraits, the watches, the devices, the branded items in the background of a social media post, silently declare about our place in today's global economic network? A Renaissance painting freezes a moment, but it also freezes a transaction, a testament to the fact that beauty has always had a price, and that price was often paid with capital that crossed deserts and seas. The portrait's golden thread leads us to a more somber ledger entry. The wealth that moved north was not only measured in dust and ingots, but in human lives. To understand the full economic reality of the Trans-Saharan trade, we must acknowledge that alongside the salt and the gold, caravans also carried individuals who had been captured in conflict or born into servitude, transported across the desert to be sold in distant markets. This was a tragic and integral part of the exchange, a shadow that lengthened alongside the glittering profits. As historian John Thornton has explained, slavery was deeply woven into the economic and social fabric of many African societies at the time, a system of labor and status that predated contact with Europe. It was not a peripheral activity, but a core component of the regional economy. The trade was always multi-commodity. While gold was the primary financial driver, the movement of enslaved people provided essential labor for the harsh environments of Saharan oases and for households, armies, and administrations across North Africa and the Middle East. This system functioned on a vast scale for centuries, creating well-established routes and markets that were distinct from, though tragically parallel to, the later Atlantic slave trade. One illustrative hub was the Zawila oasis in what is now Libya. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Zawila had grown into a major slave trading center, supplied by caravans arriving from the south. Its existence underscores how this commerce was not a hidden secret, but a normalized, organized enterprise that fueled local economies and fed demand across the Mediterranean world. The human consequence was immense, a story of families separated and lives irrevocably altered by the mechanics of long-distance exchange. This history presents us with a difficult, necessary question. How do we honestly reconcile the magnificent cultural achievements of an era, the domes and the frescoes we still admire, with the profound human suffering that often quietly underpinned its economy? Acknowledging this complexity is not about diminishing one aspect to highlight another, but about striving for a complete historical picture. The Renaissance, in all its luminous creativity, was also the product of a global system that dealt in both beauty and profound hardship. To see only the gold is to misunderstand its true, sobering cost. A Venetian merchant in Constantinople clutched a secret report, its ink still damp. It detailed a Genos captain's recent deal for a shipment of spices, and more importantly, the gold used to pay for it. In the cutthroat world of Mediterranean commerce, information about a rival's finances was a weapon. The steady stream of African gold into Italy did not create a unified boom. It poured fuel onto a fire of intense, often violent, competition between city-states. Each one knew that controlling the flow of this wealth meant survival and supremacy. This was not just business, it was geopolitics funded by desert capital. Diplomatic historians like Gino Lozatto have traced how the scramble for trade advantages directly ignited conflicts, most famously the War of Chioggia in the late 1300s, a brutal, years-long naval war between Venice and Genoa that nearly bankrupted both powers. The stakes were nothing less than dominance over the sea lanes that brought gold from North Africa to Europe. To protect their golden lifelines, the city-states were forced to innovate at a breakneck pace, investing their trade profits into three key areas: naval power, fortified strongholds, and private armies. Venice's response was the Arsenal, a massive, state-owned shipyard that was the industrial marvel of its age. Within its walled complex, an assembly line of workers could produce a fully equipped warship in a single day, a terrifying demonstration of logistical efficiency funded by the Republic's commercial wealth. Genoa, lacking Venice's protected lagoon, invested heavily in fortifying its overseas colonies. They built imposing stone citadels on islands like Chios and Corsica, creating a chain of secure way stations and monopolies. Chios was especially critical as it was the primary source of alum, the essential chemical needed to fix vibrant dyes in Italian textiles. Controlling Chios meant controlling a key input for the very cloth that was traded for gold, a perfect example of the circular, self-reinforcing nature of this economic rivalry. The third major investment was in mercenaries, the condottieri. As historian William Caffero notes, the constant state of tension and outright war meant that city-states, whose citizens were often busy as merchants, needed professional soldiers. The profits from trade allowed them to hire entire private armies, led by ambitious generals who sold their services to the highest bidder. This militarization of society, paid for by gold, turned the Italian peninsula into a chessboard of shifting alliances and proxy wars. The intense competition even refined the tools of statecraft itself. Networks of spies were funded to gather commercial intelligence, and complex diplomatic embassies were established to negotiate exclusive trading rights with foreign powers. Every florin of profit was potentially a florin for a new cannon, a faster galley, or a well-placed bribe. This relentless drive forces us to consider a difficult duality. Does the fierce competition for resources, for something as fundamental as gold, inevitably produce both destructive conflict and astonishing progress? In Renaissance Italy, the answer was a resounding yes. The fight to secure the wealth that bankrolled beauty also bankrolled a relentless arms race. It shaped the very borders and balance of power, ensuring that the political map of Italy was drawn not just by ancient lineage, but by the modern, urgent flow of capital from across the sea. A single line on a map can tell a story of empires. Visualizing the pathways of the Trans-Saharan trade is not about drawing static borders, but about revealing a living, breathing network of human connection. Modern digital humanities projects use Geographic Information Systems, or GIS, mapping to transform ledgers and chronicles into dynamic images, showing pulsating lines of movement from the gold fields of Bambuk across the desert hub of Timbuktu, through the northern gateway of Musa, to the ports of Ceuta and Tunis, and finally converging on the financial centers of Florence and Venice. Each of these points was a vital organ in a circulatory system, a node where goods were transformed, taxed, and transferred. The true power of this visualization comes when we layer time over geography. By plotting the intensification of gold flow in the 13th and 14th centuries, and then overlaying a map of major artistic commissions in the 15th, a revealing pattern emerges. There is a lag, a gap of decades between the peak of the gold influx and the explosion of cathedral domes and fresco cycles. This lag is not an accident. It is the visual signature of wealth accumulation and reinvestment. The gold had to be monetized, banked, and multiplied through credit before it could be spent on marble and ultramarine. The correlation is striking. The cities that served as the network's strongest nodes, like Florence and Venice, became the very epicenters of Renaissance patronage. Their rise was not coincidental, it was causal, built on their strategic position in the flow of capital. This method allows us to move beyond names and dates to see the architecture of influence itself. We can trace how the decline of one trading hub, like the disruption of Musa, might reroute capital through another, shifting the economic gravity that funded art. It makes an invisible force visible, so we must ask, in our own interconnected world, what are the invisible data pathways that power modern innovation? The fiber optic cables beneath the oceans and the satellite links in the sky are our caravan routes, carrying digital gold that funds new kinds of creation. Mapping the old networks teaches us to see the hidden structures that always shape the visible world. A peasant in 16th century France might stare at a loaf of bread, his hand clutching a few worn coins, and feel a deep, unnameable dread. The coins were the same, but they bought less each season. His rent, fixed by ancient custom, now consumed more of his meager harvest, pushing his family closer to hunger. He had no way of knowing that his hardship was being dictated by gold mined from a river he would never see, on a continent whose name he would never hear. This was the hidden, continental-scale consequence of the gold trade, a phenomenon economic historians call the price revolution. As scholar Earl J. Hamilton demonstrated in his landmark studies, the massive influx of precious metals, first from West Africa and then in a torrent from the Americas, fundamentally reshaped the European economy, leading to a century of sustained inflation. The mechanism, stripped to its core, is what we now call the quantity theory of money. When the amount of money in circulation increases rapidly, but the amount of goods and services available remains relatively stable, the value of each individual coin falls. Simply put, more gold and silver coins were chasing roughly the same amount of grain, cloth, and labor, so the price of everything began to climb. This was not a temporary spike, but a long, slow tide that lifted all prices, from a sack of flour to a parcel of land, reshaping society in its wake. The social impact was a dramatic transfer of wealth. Those who lived on fixed incomes, like many feudal landowners who received ancient rents set in stone, found their real income evaporating. The old aristocracy, whose power was rooted in land and static dues, began to falter. Meanwhile, the merchant class, those engaged in the dynamic flow of goods and money, thrived. Their profits rose with the general price level, and they could use their liquid capital to buy up the struggling estates of the nobility. This inflationary environment was the financial backdrop to the High Renaissance itself. We can see it in the soaring costs recorded for major projects. The salary demanded by a master painter or sculptor in the 1500s was vastly higher than that of his predecessor a century before, and the price of marble, timber, and that precious ultramarine blue pigment climbed steadily. This was not merely a reflection of greater skill or ambition, but of an entire economy being recalibrated by an abundance of metal. So we must pause and consider our own moment. Today, global capital moves not in chests of coins, but in instantaneous digital pulses across borders. How do these invisible flows, decisions made in distant trading hubs, create similar unseen pressures on the cost of our homes, our food, and our futures? The gold that built cathedrals also quietly dismantled an old economic order, proving that wealth from afar never merely decorates a society, it rewires its very foundations. Gold loses its power when no one believes its story. The legend of Mansa Musa, the 14th century emperor of Mali, is not just a tale of wealth, it is a financial ghost story, repeated for centuries to explain a market shock that rippled across the Mediterranean. The Egyptian historian al-Makrizi, writing decades later, described the emperor's pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 with awe. He claimed Musa distributed so much gold in Cairo that its value plummeted, and the city's economy did not recover for over a decade. This is the core of the sixth mystery. Were these accounts a medieval exaggeration or a sobering report on the sheer productive capacity of West Africa? To answer that, we must separate the man from the myth, using both the pen of the historian and the trowel of the archaeologist. Professor Kevin MacDonald, an archaeologist who has worked extensively on the Mali Empire, approaches the question from the ground up. His research into the gold fields and settlement patterns suggests the region was not just rich, it was systematically organized for large-scale, sustained production. The gold was not a lucky find, it was a managed resource, implying an output that could indeed support a ruler of legendary means. The primary sources themselves offer clues when read carefully. Al-Makrizi, while a meticulous scholar, was not an eyewitness. He was compiling reports from an event that had become the talk of the trade routes. His figure of 12 tons of gold carried by the caravan is often cited, but it is helpful to consider its purpose. Such stories served multiple functions. They amplified Musa's prestige as a Muslim ruler on a global stage. They served as a cautionary tale about the market's fragility in the face of a sudden supply shock. And most practically, they acted as a powerful advertisement to merchants across the Islamic world, signaling that Mali was a source of wealth worth the perilous journey. The logistical claims are where we can apply a reality check. Could a caravan truly include 60,000 people, as some accounts suggest? Moving that many people, along with their supplies, across the Sahara would be a feat bordering on the miraculous, straining the logistics of even the most abundant oases. It is more plausible that the number includes the entire population of the imperial entourage that left Mali, with only a core group completing the entire desert crossing, while others may have been soldiers, officials, and servants who traveled part of the way. The amount of gold is similarly debated. 12 tons is an almost unimaginable quantity for a single journey. but if we consider it as the total value of the pilgrimage over its entire multi-year route, including gifts, purchases, and the funding for thousands of travelers, the figure becomes less a single lump sum and more a representation of the colossal economic footprint of the Mali state. This leads us to a reflective question about our own fascination. Why do stories of unimaginable wealth, from Mansa Musa to modern billionaires, hold such power over us? They act as mirrors, reflecting our deepest anxieties and aspirations about value, power, and the sheer scale of what is possible. Deciphering this particular myth is not about dismissing it, but about calibrating it. The legend did not emerge from nothing. It grew from a kernel of monumental truth, the truth of West Africa's dominant position in the global gold supply. The market disruption in Cairo, whether it lasted a year or a decade, was a real economic event recorded by multiple sources. It was the sound of one economy, vast and resource-rich, announcing its presence to another with the unmistakable clink of gold coin. So the myth of Mansa Musa is ultimately an accounting method, a way for history to record, in the only language vivid enough, that the scales of medieval wealth were tipped by a power from the south. The final destination of a Florentine florin was often a small, heavy pouch of powdered stone. That coin, its metal once dust in a West African river, now purchased the most coveted color in the artist's workshop, ultramarine blue. This was not mere shopping. It was the culmination of a global supply chain, where Renaissance art reveals itself as a meticulously budgeted economic operation. In his practical guide for painters, The Craftsman's Handbook, the artist Cennino Cennini wrote with reverence about this pigment. He instructed that ultramarine, ground from lapis lazuli mined only in Afghanistan, was, quote, reserved for the robes of Our Lady and for the most magnificent works, unquote, and he warned that its cost was so high you should use it sparingly. That single bag of blue powder represented a staggering investment, a direct line from a Medici vault through Venetian spice merchants who also traded in gems across the Indian Ocean to a remote mountain valley. The masterpiece was a final assembly of dozens of such journeys. The brilliant red vermilion came from Cinnabar, a mercury ore mined with great hardship in Spain or Italy. The pristine white lead was produced through a corrosive process involving vinegar and metal plates. The finest canvases and oak panels were imported from the forests of the Balkans or the skilled weavers of Flanders. Even the walnut oil used to mix paints and create glossy varnishes was a traded commodity, pressed from nuts grown in specialized orchards. Every component arrived via a network of merchants, shippers, and middlemen, all conducting business on the credit and currency that the gold influx made stable. Funding this supply chain required a small army of specialized laborers, all paid from the same pool of gold-backed florins. The master painter, whose name we remember, stood at the top of a pyramid. Below him were his apprentices, who prepared panels and ground pigments for years before touching a brush. Independent frame makers carved and gilded elaborate wooden borders. Specialist gilders applied delicate gold leaf, a skill entirely separate from painting. There were even tradesmen who did nothing but manufacture and sell brushes, each a tiny tool in a vast enterprise. We can see this financial reality frozen in time within surviving contracts. The agreement for Piero della Francesca's fresco cycle in the Church of San Francesco in Arezzo is remarkably detailed. It specifies not just the subject matter and completion date, but breaks down costs for specific quantities of lime for plaster, for expensive pigments, and for the wages of the master and his assistants, every item priced in a reliable currency. This forces us to consider a painting in a new light. When you stand before a luminous Renaissance altarpiece, are you seeing only a spiritual vision, or can you perceive the intricate web of commerce it represents? That celestial blue robe of the Virgin is also an invoice, a receipt for a transaction that spanned continents. Every brushstroke had a price, and that price was paid in the hard, reliable currency that distant gold made possible. Silence settles over a caravanserai that once echoed with a dozen languages. By the 16th century, many of these desert way stations stood half empty, their great courtyards quiet, their storerooms holding only dust. The camels that remained were no longer laden with slabs of salt or pouches of gold dust for a transcontinental journey, but were repurposed for local transport, carrying goods between nearby oases. The mighty artery of the Sahara was beginning to constrict, its lifeblood of gold finding a new, faster path to the sea. Historians point to a single, decisive year as the turning point, 1482. It was then that Portuguese caravels, having painstakingly mapped the West African coast, established a fortified trading post they called São Jorge do Mina, Elmina Castle, on the shoreline of present-day Ghana. This stone fortress, rising from the tropical coast, represented a technological and strategic end run around 1,000 years of established commerce. For the first time, European merchants could bypass the entire Saharan caravan network. They could now trade directly with coastal and near-coastal suppliers, offering textiles, brassware, and later, firearms in exchange for gold right at its source. The cascade effect was both swift and devastating for the old intermediaries. The Berber and Tuareg merchants who had mastered the desert saw their indispensable role evaporate. The North African port cities that had grown fat on taxes and Chinese letter saw their golden stream diverted to ships sailing around their coasts. Their political power, built on controlling this flow, began to wane as their economic relevance faded. This was not an immediate collapse, but a slow, relentless draining of significance. The ocean highway was simply more efficient, able to move larger volumes at lower cost and risk than a train of camels crossing a continent of sand. Other currents of change accelerated the decline. The very success of European exploration led to the staggering influx of precious metals from the Americas. Beginning in the 16th century, Spanish galleons began hauling immense quantities of silver from Potosi and gold from Mexico back to Seville. This new flood of bullion further diminished the relative importance of West African gold in the European financial system. Why pay a premium for gold that came through a long, costly desert chain when mountains of silver were arriving directly from across the Atlantic? Simultaneously, the great Sahelian empires that had managed the southern end of the trade faced their own internal unraveling. The Songhai Empire, which had succeeded Mali, was shattered by a Moroccan invasion in the 1590s, a conflict driven in part by a desire to seize the gold trade directly. This invasion introduced firearms and chaos, disrupting the stable political environment that long-distance commerce required. The result can be seen in the fading glory of Timbuktu. The city whose scholars and merchants had once been at the heart of global exchange gradually receded from the world stage. Its universities remained, its libraries preserved their treasures, but the constant hum of international commerce that funded that intellectual life grew quieter. The city became more remote, more a legend of past wealth than a present powerhouse. This history invites a sobering reflection on the nature of progress. What does the fate of this magnificent trade route, a system that bankrolled continents for centuries, teach us about the vulnerability of even the most established and sophisticated networks? It demonstrates that no monopoly on knowledge or geography is permanent. The specialized skill of desert navigation, passed down through generations, was ultimately circumvented by a new technology, the deep-hulled, ocean-going ship. The trust built over centuries between Saharan and Sudanese merchants was bypassed by the cannon and the compass. The desert tracks, etched so deeply into the earth by countless caravans, were not erased, but they were overshadowed by the faster, cheaper highways of the sea, leaving the caravanserai to the wind and the sand. The dirt of a forgotten cellar can hold a fortune, An archaeologist's trowel scrapes gently against a coarse clay pot, and a soft, metallic glint catches the light. Inside are not shards of pottery, but a dense, silent congregation of medieval gold coins, packed away in a moment of fear and left for centuries. This is a coin hoard, a time capsule of pure capital, and it offers us perhaps the most tangible tip for understanding the hidden economy of the past. To study these hoards is to practice the archaeology of capital flow, reading not in ledgers but in metal, uncovering snapshots of prosperity, panic, and connection. Numismatists, the scientists of currency, approach these finds with forensic care. They examine the mint marks, identifying which prince or republic struck the coin. They study the wear along the edges, estimating how many hands it passed through and for how long it circulated. Most telling of all is the location of the discovery. A pot of coins buried under the hearthstone of a rural cottage tells a different story than one hidden within the walls of a merchant's house in a bustling port city. Each detail is a clue to the invisible movements of wealth. The most revealing hoards are those that contain a mixture of currencies from disparate realms. Imagine uncovering a cache in a field in southern France, sealed in the 13th century. Inside, you find not only the local French écus, but also gleaming Florentine florins, and, remarkably, a number of North African gold dinars from the Almohad dynasty. This is not an accident. This mixture is direct physical evidence of integrated monetary zones. It proves that a merchant in Provence considered an African dinar to be as reliable and liquid as a European florin, that these coins circulated together, accepted across cultural and religious lines because their gold content was trusted. They are the metallic proof of the desert to Duomo pipeline, frozen in a single, buried moment. But why were these savings so urgently hidden and never retrieved? The answer almost always points to a sudden, catastrophic break in the normal order. War, invasion, or a devastating raid would send a family or a merchant into a panic. Burying your wealth was the only hope of preserving it from looters with the intention of returning when the danger passed. Tragically, if the person who knew the secret location did not survive the conflict, the hoard remained in the earth, a monument to a crisis that turned liquid capital into a frozen asset. A stunning example emerged in the Netherlands in 2008. Construction workers in the town of Hoogwoud unearthed a pottery jug containing over 450 gold coins from the 14th century. The collection was breathtaking in its geographic scope. It included English nobles, Rhineland guilders, Venetian ducats, and even coins from the Middle East. This single jug, buried by a wealthy merchant or perhaps a monastic house, tells a silent story of the North Sea and Baltic trade networks, showing how capital from all over Europe and beyond converged in the Low Countries. It is a snapshot of a deeply interconnected continent, a web of finance made solid. This leads us to a hauntingly modern question. In our digital age, where wealth is so often a number on a screen, a cloud-based entry, what physical artifacts would we leave behind if our system vanished? Our plastic cards and sleek devices would crumble to dust in a few centuries. Future archaeologists might find only cryptic server farms, indecipherable without the lost code to access them. The gold florin and dinar, by contrast, are durable fossils. They required no password, no special reader. Their value and origin were stamped directly onto their faces, meant to be understood across languages and millennia. They were their own receipt, their own contract, and their own story, waiting in the dark for a trowel to set their narrative back into motion. The perfect balance of a ledger is a kind of poetry written in numbers. On a page from the late 1400s, two columns of elegant script face each other, one labeled per for debtor, the other a for creditor. Every transaction is recorded twice. A purchase of wool cloth in one column creates an equal debt in the other. A shipment of gold dust received is an asset that must be matched by an obligation. This is double-entry bookkeeping, the silent, systematic language that made the sprawling complexity of Renaissance commerce and its dependence on distant gold not just possible but manageable. It was a tool born from urgent necessity, as trade networks stretched from the banks of the Senegal River to the Rialto market, tracking partnerships, agents abroad, and shipments of uncertain value became a labyrinthine task. The old methods, simple lists of income and outgo, could not answer the most critical question for a merchant with investments across 3 continents: am I truly making a profit? The system's great codifier was a Franciscan friar and mathematician named Luca Pacioli. In 1494, he published a comprehensive work on mathematics that included a detailed section on bookkeeping, Particularis de Computis et Scripturis. He did not claim to invent the system. He openly credited its development and use by the merchants of Venice, Genoa, and Florence, writing that it was essential for anyone who wished to conduct business in an orderly fashion. This was an admission that the real innovation happened not in a monastery, but in the counting houses along trade routes, where the relentless flow of goods and capital demanded a new clarity. The connection to the gold trade is direct. Consider the challenges of a merchant bank like the Medici. They had a branch in Bruges buying English wool with Florins, an agent in Alexandria trading cloth for spices and possibly gold dust, and a headquarters in Florence issuing letters of credit. Without a system to consolidate all these global movements into a single, coherent financial picture, the operation would collapse into chaos. Double-entry bookkeeping provided that framework. Every shipment of African oro di paglia received in Pisa was entered as an asset, but it also created a corresponding entry, a debt owed to the North African supplier or a reduction in the value of the textiles sent south. This allowed for the precise calculation of profit on a single voyage, stripping away the confusion of multiple currencies and delayed payments. It also served as a powerful deterrent to fraud, as any manipulation of the books would break the sacred balance between the 2 columns, making discrepancies easier for partners or investors to spot. We can see this system in its formative stages in surviving records, like the ledger of the Soranzo brothers, Venetian merchants in the early 1400s. Their accounts for trade with Cyprus and Alexandria show a clear, though not yet fully refined, effort to achieve this double-sided balance, tracking the complex exchange of silver, cotton, and spices. This was the financial infrastructure being built in real time to handle a globalizing economy, so we must ask a foundational question about our modern world. Could the corporate empires of today, with their subsidiaries in a dozen countries and their supply chains spanning the globe, exist without the accounting frameworks pioneered during this commercial revolution? The clear, ordered lines of the ledger were the necessary complement to the chaotic, risky, and glorious pursuit of distant gold. They translated the raw metal of ambition into a rational grammar of profit, proving that the Renaissance was built not just on artistic vision, but on a revolutionary vision of clarity, one debit and one credit at a time. A European masterpiece and a West African bronze sit side by side. One is a luminous oil painting of a saint, the other a cast metal sculpture of a royal figure. At first glance, they seem worlds apart, products of entirely separate artistic universes. But what if they are actually 2 leaves on the same global tree? This is the final, crucial step in our journey, a complete reframing of the era we call the Renaissance. For centuries, the dominant story has been one of a European miracle, a sudden rebirth of genius that emerged solely from the soil of Italy. But as global historian Jerry Broughton compellingly argues, this view is not just incomplete, it is a distortion. The Renaissance was not an isolated event, but a pivotal moment in a vast, pre-existing network of global exchanges. It was a world, not just a region. To see it clearly, we must synthesize all the evidence we have gathered. the financial fuel, the very capital that paid for brushes, marble, and scholarship, was West African gold, monetized and multiplied by Mediterranean trade. The intellectual spark, the recovered works of Aristotle, Plato, and Ptolemy, were preserved for centuries by Islamic and Byzantine scholars, then translated and transmitted back to Europe through the very same contact zones where goods were traded. The material desires, the markets for luxury that patrons sought to emulate, were inspired by silks, spices, and intricate goods from Asia, which arrived on the same ships that carried financial news. Recognizing these profound contributions does not in any way diminish the extraordinary agency and creativity of European artists, bankers, and thinkers. Instead, it places their achievements in a realistic and far more interesting context. It shows that their genius was not conjured from nothing, but was a brilliant synthesis, a remixing of ideas, materials, and capital that flowed from across the known world. We can see this synthesis in stone and geometry. Look at the majestic dome of the Florence Cathedral, Brunelleschi's triumph. Its construction relied on advanced mathematical and engineering principles. Some of that knowledge, particularly in geometry, was directly influenced by Islamic scientific texts, which had been studying and expanding upon classical learning for centuries. These texts often traveled the same routes as trade goods, moving from centers like Baghdad or Cairo to Palermo or Toledo, where they were translated and studied. The same Mediterranean that carried gold from Tunis to Genoa also carried packets of knowledge, making the Renaissance as much a project of translation and transmission as of pure invention. This interconnected view challenges a deep-seated historical narrative. It asks us to let go of the idea of civilizational isolation and embrace a story of constant, if not always equal, exchange. So we are left with a reflective question that reshapes how we see not just the past but our own time. Does viewing history as a collaborative network rather than a series of isolated triumphs make the human story less majestic, or does it actually become more accurate, more complex, and in a profound way more inspiring? It reveals that our greatest cultural flowerings are rarely solo performances, but symphonies, composed from notes that have traveled unimaginable distances to be heard together at just the right moment. The Florins that built Florence did not vanish, they simply evolved. Their journey from West African dust to European currency established a pattern so powerful it would outlast empires, a phenomenon economists call path dependency. This means the initial routes and hubs of this medieval trade created deep grooves in the global landscape, directing the flow of capital for centuries to come. The financial centers that rose to prominence later, like Antwerp, Amsterdam, and ultimately London, did not start from scratch. They inherited and expanded upon the very systems, the networks of trust, and the concentration of expertise first pioneered by the Italian city-states flush with Trans-Saharan gold. The need to manage the immense risks and rewards of long-distance commerce forced constant innovation. Consider the challenge of funding a voyage to the Indies, an endeavor far riskier and more expensive than a Mediterranean trade run. No single merchant, not even the Medici, could shoulder that cost alone. The solution, emerging in the 16th and 17th centuries, was the joint stock company and the formal stock exchange. Places like the Amsterdam Bourse became markets where shares in these risky ventures could be bought and sold, spreading the financial danger and pooling capital on a previously unimaginable scale. This was a direct institutional evolution from the earlier partnerships and credit instruments used to fund Saharan caravans and spice shipments. Similarly, the modern insurance market has its roots in the coffee houses of London, where underwriters would literally sign their names beneath a ship's manifest, pledging to cover a portion of its loss for a fee. This practice grew directly out of the maritime insurance contracts developed by Italian merchants to protect their cargoes of gold, cloth, and alum. The bill of exchange, that lightweight piece of paper that moved fortunes across Europe, is the clear ancestor of the modern check, the letter of credit, and even the complex derivatives that define today's financial markets. It established the principle that trust and a written promise could be as valuable as physical metal, a conceptual leap that made our entire globalized economy possible. We can still see this legacy in the geography of power. The City of London, that square mile of towering banks and ancient guild halls, is not a random accident. Its financial preeminence grew directly from England's role in the wool trade with Flanders and its later dominance in global commerce. Its physical layout, its institutions like Lloyd's of London, are living artifacts of a commercial revolution that began centuries earlier, a revolution whose initial spark was often African gold transformed into reliable coin. Even our modern currencies whisper of this past. For most of modern history, major currencies like the British pound sterling and the United States dollar were explicitly backed by gold reserves. This gold standard was a direct descendant of the Florentine Florins promise, the idea that a slip of paper or a ledger entry must represent a tangible, trusted store of value. That system has now been replaced by fiat currency, money based on government decree, but the ghost of that requirement for trust and stability remains the central concern of every central bank in the world. So we are left with a quiet, pervasive truth. The past is not a separate country, it is the foundation upon which our present is built. How many of our current economic structures, from the stock ticker scrolling on a screen to the very concept of a central bank, are invisible legacies of choices made centuries ago on desert trails and in Mediterranean counting houses? The networks established to move gold from riverbeds to royal patrons created a financial DNA that we have inherited and replicated on a planetary scale. The Renaissance was not just an age of art, it was the prototyping phase for the modern world's economic operating system. A river of gold once flowed across a desert, and on its far shore a new world was built. Our journey has traced that current from the silt of West African rivers to the vaults of Florentine banks, revealing a truth often left out of the frame. The masterpieces of the Renaissance, those icons of European genius, were quietly financed by a partnership that spanned continents and cultures. This is not a minor historical detail, but a fundamental rewriting of a familiar story. The brilliance of that age was not a solitary flame, but a fire stoked by a global network, its fuel mined from the heart of Africa. The florin in a merchant's hand, the credit note that funded a voyage, the very stability that allowed art to be a calculated investment, all were made possible by the relentless, centuries-long flow of gold across the Sahara. To see the Sistine Chapel or Brunelleschi's dome without this context is to admire a magnificent tree while ignoring the vast, hidden root system that gave it life. This interconnected view challenges the old, comfortable narrative of isolated civilizations achieving greatness alone. Instead, it presents a world already deeply linked, where the fate of art in Florence could be decided by a trade agreement in Timbuktu or the safe arrival of a caravan at a North African port. It restores agency and sophistication to the African empires that managed this wealth, showing them not as passive sources of raw material, but as active, powerful participants in a sprawling economic web. Their gold did not just buy salt and textiles, it bought a transformation of the world far beyond their borders. So let this knowledge reframe what you see. Let the gleam on a gilded frame remind you of dust panned from a distant river. Let the serene face of a painted saint call to mind the determined faces of the merchants and guides who crossed a sea of sand. The Renaissance was a symphony, and its most crucial instrument was a currency forged from African gold. This story of silent partnership is a powerful reminder that human history is rarely a series of isolated triumphs, but a continuous tapestry woven from countless threads, many of which travel farther than we ever knew. If this vision of a connected past resonates with you, we would love to hear your reflections in the comments. And for more journeys into the hidden networks that shaped our world, consider subscribing. The next time your eyes linger on a Renaissance masterpiece, you will now see more than pigment and perspective. You will see the enduring echo of a caravan's bell ringing across the dunes of time.